Months had passed since James's life took its unexpected turn, and he was finally starting to feel like he belonged somewhere again. The apartment he called home wasn't fancy, but it was his. A safe haven where he could close the door at night and know that no one would bother him. For the first time in years, he didn't have to worry about finding shelter or scavenging for food. He had stability, something he hadn't realized he'd been craving until it became a reality. But what truly changed James wasn't just the roof over his head or the job he now held. It was the sense of purpose he'd rediscovered. Every day, he woke up knowing that his actions mattered not just to himself but to others. Whether it was mentoring struggling veterans at the community center or speaking at events to raise awareness about homelessness, James poured his energy into helping people who reminded him of his former self. These connections gave him a renewed sense of identity, one that went beyond being a homeless veteran or a criminal. He was more than those labels. He always had been. One crisp autumn morning, James received an invitation to attend a special ceremony honoring local heroes. At first, he hesitated. The thought of standing in front of a crowd made his stomach twist with anxiety. But then he remembered why he agreed to speak publicly in the first place: to give hope to those who felt invisible. So, after some encouragement from Teresa, his counselor, he accepted the invitation. The event was held in a large auditorium filled with rows of chairs, all occupied by families, veterans, activists, and city officials. Banners hung from the walls, celebrating acts of courage and service. As James walked onto the stage alongside other honorees, he couldn't help but feel out of place. Compared to the firefighters, teachers, and doctors receiving awards that evening, he didn't see himself as heroic. He was just a man trying to survive, trying to make amends for years lost to hardship. When it came time for him to speak, James stepped up to the microphone, gripping the sides tightly to steady his nerves. The spotlight felt hot on his skin, and for a moment he wondered if he should have stayed seated. But then he glanced out at the audience and saw familiar faces. Veterans he'd mentored, social workers who had helped him, even the judge who had stood up for him months ago. Their presence reminded him that this wasn't about him. It was about the message he carried. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when someone remembered my name," James began, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "For years I felt forgotten, not just by society but by myself. I let the pain of my past define me, and I let the world convince me that I didn't matter." He paused, scanning the room. Some people nodded in understanding, while others wiped away tears. But here's the thing: we all matter. Every single person sitting in this room has value whether they realize it or not. And sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to remind you of that. James went on to share snippets of his journey: the war, the nightmares, the loneliness, and the redemption he found through compassion and second chances. He spoke candidly about how hard it had been to ask for help and how much harder it had been to forgive himself. His words weren't polished or rehearsed. They were raw and honest, straight from the heart, and that's what resonated most with the audience. By the time he finished, the entire auditorium erupted into applause. People stood clapping and cheering, moved by his story and the resilience it represented. James stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by the response. He hadn't expected such warmth, such gratitude. All he wanted was to plant a seed of hope in someone else's mind, and judging by the looks on their faces, he'd succeeded. After the ceremony, James mingled with attendees, shaking hands and exchanging stories. Many people approached him, eager to thank him for sharing his experience. One young man, barely in his 20s, lingered near the edge of the crowd, looking unsure of whether to approach. James noticed him and waved him over. "You okay?" James asked kindly, sensing the young man's hesitation. I just wanted to say thank you," the man stammered, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Your story, it's like you're telling mine. I'm a vet too, and I've been struggling since I got back. Hearing you talk makes me think maybe I can get through this too." James smiled softly, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "You can," he said firmly. "It won't be easy, But you don't have to do it alone. Reach out. Ask for help. You'll be surprised how many people care. The young man nodded, visibly relieved before walking away with a newfound determination in his step. Moments like these reminded James why he kept pushing forward. If his story could inspire even one person to keep fighting, then everything he'd endured was worth it. As weeks turned into months, James continued to build a new life for himself. He worked part-time at the warehouse during the week and volunteered at the community center on weekends. The paycheck might not have been huge, but it allowed him to cover his expenses and save a little for the future. More importantly, the work gave him structure and a sense of accomplishment. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. His health improved dramatically as well. With access to regular medical care, James addressed issues he'd ignored for years. A doctor diagnosed him with high blood pressure and prescribed medication to manage it. Physical therapy helped alleviate the chronic pain in his knees, a lingering injury from his military days. Even his mental health showed signs of progress. While PTSD still lingered, it no longer controlled him. Through counseling and support groups, James learned to confront his demons instead of running from them. Socially, James began reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. One of his fellow veterans introduced him to a group that met weekly to play chess and swap stories. Another friend invited him to join a hiking club, which pushed him to explore nature and stay active. Slowly but surely, James rebuilt his network, surrounding himself with people who uplifted and encouraged him. Meanwhile, the judge who had championed James's cause remained a steadfast ally. She often checked in on him, asking how things were going and offering guidance whenever needed. Together they collaborated on expanding the Veterans Justice Program, ensuring it reached communities across the country. The initiative gained national attention, earning praise from lawmakers and advocacy groups alike. At a press conference announcing the program's expansion, the judge took a moment to acknowledge James. "None of this would have happened without him," she said, gesturing toward him as cameras flashed. "His courage to share his story inspired us to take action. We owe him, and countless others like him, a debt of gratitude." James blushed at the recognition, uncomfortable with the spotlight. But deep down he felt proud. Proud of how far he'd come, proud of the lives he'd touched, and proud of the system-wide changes sparked by his journey. Looking back on everything, James realized that his story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation, from despair to hope, from invisibility to visibility, from brokenness to wholeness. He understood now that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a process, one that required patience, effort, and faith. Faith in himself, in others, and in the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, James sat on a park bench, the same one where he used to sleep during his darkest days. This time, though, he wasn't hunched over, shivering from the cold. He sat upright, watching children play and couples stroll by. A soft breeze rustled the leaves above him, carrying with it a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. As he reflected on his journey, James whispered a silent thank you. To the judge who believed in him, to the strangers who offered kindness, and to the younger version of himself who refused to give up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Life hadn't been fair to him, but he'd fought back anyway. And in doing so, he proved that no matter how far you fall, it's never too late to rise again. The days following James's court appearance felt surreal, like he was living someone else's life. For so long he'd been invisible, just another faceless figure on the streets, ignored by passers-by and forgotten by society. But now, everything had changed. The judge's words echoed in his mind constantly. "Let's fix that." Those three simple words carried more weight than anything anyone had said to him in decades. They weren't empty promises. They were a lifeline thrown into the stormy sea of his existence. Within hours of leaving the courtroom, James found himself surrounded by people who wanted to help. Social workers arrived at the courthouse, armed with folders filled with resources and plans tailored specifically for him. At first, he was hesitant. He'd learned over the years not to trust easily. The world had taught him that kindness often came with strings attached. But there was something different about these people. Their eyes didn't hold pity or judgment. Instead, they radiated genuine concern and determination. One of the social workers, an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile, sat down with James in a quiet corner of the courthouse. "We're going to take this step by step," he said, gently. "First thing we need to do is get you off the streets. There's a transitional housing program available right now, and I think it'll be a good fit for you." James nodded slowly, processing the information. Transitional housing? It sounded too good to be true. For years, he'd slept in abandoned buildings, under bridges, or on park benches. The idea of having 4 walls and a roof over his head felt foreign, almost intimidating. What if he couldn't adjust? What if he messed it up somehow? "We'll make sure you have everything you need," the social worker reassured him, sensing his hesitation. "It's not just about giving you a place to stay. It's about helping you rebuild your life. That includes counseling, job training, medical care. Whatever you need, we'll find a way to provide it." Counseling. The word sent a shiver down James's spine. Talking about his past, about the war and all the pain that followed, wasn't something he relished. But deep down he knew it was necessary. How could he move forward if he kept running from the ghosts of his past? Still, the thought of sitting in a room with a stranger spilling out his darkest secrets made his stomach churn. Despite his reservations, James agreed to give it a try. After all, what did he have to lose? For once, doors were opening for him instead of slamming shut. He owed it to himself, and maybe even to the judge who had stood up for him, to walk through those doors and see where they led. A few days later, James moved into a small but clean apartment provided by the Transitional Housing Program. It wasn't luxurious, just a single bedroom, a tiny kitchenette, and a bathroom. But to James, it felt like a palace. The walls were freshly painted, the floors spotless, and the bed soft enough to sink into after a long day. For the first time in years, he had privacy, dignity, and a sense of security. But the real work began shortly after he settled in. His counselor, a woman named Teresa, visited him regularly to check in and guide him through the process of healing. Their session started awkwardly, with James struggling to open up. He'd spent so many years bottling up his emotions that letting them out felt unnatural, even dangerous. But Teresa was patient. She didn't push him. She simply listened, offering encouragement when he needed it most. Over time, James began to share more. He talked about the horrors of war, the friends he lost, the civilians caught in the crossfire, the guilt that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He spoke about coming home to a world that didn't understand him, where people expected him to pick up where he left off without acknowledging the scars he carried. And he confessed how hard it was to ask for help, especially when it felt like no one cared enough to offer it. Teresa didn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. Instead, she helped James confront his pain head-on, teaching him coping strategies to manage his PTSD and anxiety. Slowly but surely, he began to feel lighter, as though the weight pressing down on him was finally lifting. It wasn't a cure. He still had bad days. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Meanwhile, news of James's story spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Reporters picked up on the dramatic turn of events, publishing articles, and airing segments about the homeless veteran whose act of heroism decades earlier saved the life of a prominent judge. Veterans organizations rallied around James, eager to support him in any way they could. Donations poured in from across the country, funding programs aimed at helping other struggling veterans get back on their feet. Inspired by James's journey, the judge launched a campaign to reform the legal system's approach to cases involving veterans and the homeless. She argued that punishment alone wasn't enough, that true justice required addressing the root causes of crime rather than simply locking people away. Her efforts gained traction quickly, earning endorsements from lawmakers, activists, and community leaders alike. At the heart of her proposal was a new initiative called the Veterans Justice Program. Designed to identify individuals with military backgrounds entering the legal system, the program would connect them with specialized resources, including mental health services, housing assistance, and job placement opportunities. By treating Veterans as unique cases deserving of tailored solutions, the program aimed to break the cycle of poverty, homelessness, and incarceration that plagued so many who served. James became the face of the movement, though reluctantly. Public speaking terrified him, but he understood the importance of sharing his story. If doing so could prevent others from ending up where he had been, then it was worth stepping outside his comfort zone. So, he agreed to speak at rallies, conferences, and fundraisers, standing tall despite the nerves gnawing at him. Each time he spoke, his voice grew stronger, his confidence building. He told audiences about the loneliness of being homeless, the frustration of being judged without being understood, and the transformative power of compassion. People listened, not because they felt sorry for him, but because they saw themselves in his story. His struggles resonated with anyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard, reminding them that change was possible, even in the darkest moments. As months passed, James continued to rebuild his life, piece by piece. With the help of job training programs, he secured a part-time position at a local warehouse. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him purpose and routine, two things he desperately needed. On weekends, he volunteered at a community center for veterans, mentoring others who were struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Sharing his experiences with fellow vets brought him immense satisfaction, knowing he could be the lifeline someone else desperately needed. His physical health improved too. Regular meals, access to health care, and a stable living environment worked wonders for his body, which had endured years of neglect. Those scars remained, both visible and invisible. They no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd come and how much strength it took to keep moving forward. Through it all, James never forgot the judge who changed everything. Occasionally, they crossed paths at events or ceremonies honoring veterans, and each time, she greeted him warmly, always expressing gratitude for what he'd done for her all those years ago. To James, though, it wasn't about saving one person. It was about serving humanity, about doing what was right regardless of recognition. Yet, he couldn't deny that her actions had sparked a chain reaction that transformed his life and countless others. By the end of the year, James looked like a completely different man. Gone was the hunched posture, the hollow eyes, the defeated demeanor. In their place stood someone proud, resilient, and determined to make the most of the second chance he'd been given. He still had challenges ahead, of course. Life wasn't perfect, but he faced them with courage and hope, knowing he wasn't alone anymore. And as he stood on stage at a charity gala one evening, accepting an award for his advocacy work, James realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about finding meaning in it, turning pain into purpose, and proving that no matter how far you fall, it's never too late to rise again. The courtroom remained silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like time has stopped. Everyone was still processing what had just happened, the judge's revelation, James's story, and the undeniable weight of it all. The air felt heavy, charged with emotions that no one knew how to release. For James, this was overwhelming. He stood there, his head bowed, trying to process the fact that the woman in front of him, a judge, someone who held authority over his fate, owed her life to him. It didn't make sense. How could someone who saved lives end up here, accused of crimes born out of desperation? The judge took a deep breath, clearly struggling to gather her thoughts. She glanced down at the file in front of her again as if searching for answers or guidance, but she already knew what needed to be done. This wasn't about following protocol anymore. This was personal. This was about righting a wrong that had festered for far too long. "James," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "I need you to tell me more. I want to understand. Not just what brought you here today, but everything that led to this moment. Your struggles, your pain, your fight to survive. Don't hold back." James hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not in front of a room full of strangers. Most days he tried to blend into the background, hoping people wouldn't notice him. But now, all eyes were on him, and for once, They weren't judging him, they were listening. That realization alone was enough to loosen the knot in his chest, even if only slightly. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice low and rough like sandpaper against wood. "It's been so long since anyone asked me questions like this. People usually just look at me and assume they know my story before I even open my mouth." "Well, I'm asking now," the judge replied, leaning forward slightly. Her tone was encouraging, almost maternal. "Start wherever you feel comfortable." So James began to talk. At first, his words came out haltingly, piecing together fragments of memories that had long been buried under layers of shame and regret. He spoke about coming home from the war, about how excited he'd been to reunite with loved ones and start fresh. But reality hit hard and fast. His family was gone. His parents had passed away while he was deployed, and his siblings had scattered across the country, too busy with their own lives to reconnect. Without them, he felt untethered, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed foreign and unwelcoming. He talked about the nightmares, the flashbacks that haunted him every night. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memories of gunfire, explosions, and screams. Sleep became an enemy instead of a refuge, and without rest, his body and mind began to break down. Jobs slipped through his fingers because he couldn't focus or stay calm when things got stressful. Friends drifted away, unable to handle his mood swings or the darkness that clung to him like a shadow. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," James said, his voice breaking. "I thought serving my country would mean something. I thought people would care when I came back. But instead I ended up invisible, like none of it mattered." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Spectators shifted uncomfortably, in their seats, some wiping away tears, others exchanging glances filled with guilt or disbelief. Even the prosecutor, who had entered the courtroom ready to argue for punishment, now looked conflicted. The man flipped through his notes absently, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The judge listened intently, her expression softening with each word James spoke. When he finally fell silent, she nodded slowly, as though confirming something she already suspected. "You've carried this burden alone for far too long," she said, "and we, the system, society, we failed you. We sent you off to fight for us, and when you came back broken, we turned our backs. That's not justice, that's not humanity." Her voice grew stronger, more determined, as she addressed the entire courtroom. "This man standing before us, he's not just another case. He's a veteran, a hero, someone who risked his life for people he didn't even know. And yet here he is, accused of trespassing because he had nowhere else to go, because we didn't give him the support he needed. Does that sound fair to anyone?" No one answered. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Some people looked down at their laps, ashamed. Others stared at James, seeing him in a new light, not as a criminal, but as a person who deserved better. "I'm dismissing all charges against you, James," the judge announced, her voice ringing out like a gavel striking wood. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of surprise and approval. "Effective immediately. You won't be punished for surviving." James blinked, stunned. Dismissal? No fine? No jail time? He hadn't dared to hope for such an outcome. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed to say, his voice trembling. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the judge replied, smiling faintly. "But this isn't the end, it's just the beginning." She turned to the bailiff and instructed him to contact social services immediately. "We're going to get James housing assistance, mental health counseling, job training, whatever he needs to rebuild his life. And I want updates on his progress. This isn't optional, it's mandatory." Then she addressed the crowd directly. "To everyone here today, let this be a lesson. Veterans like James aren't statistics. They're human beings. If we can't take care of the people who sacrifice everything for us, then what kind of society are we? Let's do better. Starting now." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of action. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, eager to share the story with the world. Lawyers whispered among themselves, discussing ways to reform policies affecting veterans and the homeless. Even the prosecutor nodded approvingly, realizing that justice sometimes meant offering help instead of handing down punishment. As the courtroom began to empty, James lingered near the bench, unsure of what to do next. The judge approached him, extending a hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes shining with gratitude. "For saving my life. For reminding me why I became a judge in the first place. To make a difference." James shook her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite everything he'd been through. "I didn't do it for thanks," he murmured. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's exactly why you deserve better than what life has given you so far," the judge responded. "Now let's fix that." With those words, she walked away, leaving James standing there, surrounded by people who finally saw him, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth fighting for. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Everyone sat frozen, unsure of what to do or say. The judge standing up like that, it wasn't something anyone had ever seen before. Usually, judges stayed, seated, calm and collected, delivering their verdicts with authority but without much emotion. But this was different. It felt personal, raw, almost sacred. James shifted uncomfortably where he stood. His hands were still clasped together, fingers trembling slightly. He didn't know what to make of the situation. One moment, he'd been waiting for his sentence, resigned to whatever punishment they decided to give him. The next, the judge, was looking at him like she'd seen a ghost. And then she stood up, her face pale, her eyes locked onto his as if she couldn't look away. "Do you remember me?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft now, almost hesitant. Nothing like the firm tone she'd used earlier. James blinked, taken aback by the question. Remember her? How could he possibly remember someone sitting high above him in a judge's robe? He shook his head slowly, unsure of what to say. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I do." The judge let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. She looked down at the file in front of her again as if searching for confirmation, then back at James. 25 years ago, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You saved my life." The words hit James like a punch, to the gut. Save her life? What was she talking about? He stared at her, his mind racing, trying to piece together fragments of memories from decades ago. Back then, he'd been a young soldier, full of energy and purpose, serving his country, overseas. He remembered the chaos of war, the explosions, the gunfire, the endless nights spent wondering if he'd make it home alive. But faces, names, those blurred together over time, lost in the fog of trauma and pain. I don't understand," James stammered, shaking his head again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't." "It's okay," the judge interrupted, gently, holding up a hand to stop him. "You don't have to apologize. Let me explain." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that silenced any lingering murmurs in the room. "During Operation Desert Storm, my unit came under heavy fire. We were ambushed, pinned down behind enemy lines. I was injured, badly, and couldn't move. Most of us thought we weren't going to make it out alive." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And then your unit arrived. You led the charge to get us out of there. I remember seeing you running toward us despite the danger, bullets flying everywhere. When you reached us, you carried me to safety. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today." James listened to her words, his chest tightening with each sentence. Memories started flooding back, flashes of sandstorms, the sound of helicopters overhead, the weight of a wounded soldier in his arms. He remembered carrying someone, yes, but the details were hazy, distorted by time and trauma. War did that to people. It made heroes forget their own acts of bravery, leaving only scars behind. I didn't know." James said finally, his voice cracking. I mean, I remember bits and pieces, but not enough to put it all together. Not enough to know who. He trailed off, gesturing helplessly toward the judge. She nodded, understanding. You probably saved dozens of lives that day, she said softly. But for me, you gave me a second chance at life. A chance to come home, to build a career, to become a judge. And yet here you are, standing in front of me, accused of crimes because society failed you. Failed you. Of all people. Her last words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The prosecutor, who had been ready to argue for stricter penalties just moments earlier, now looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in his seat. Even the bailiff seemed affected, glancing between the judge and James with a mix of confusion and sympathy. The judge took a deep breath, composing herself before continuing. When I saw your name on the file, it brought everything rushing. Beck, I've never forgotten what you did for me, never. And now to see you here in this position, she shook her head, visibly struggling to keep her emotions in check. It breaks my heart. James felt a lump rise in his throat. Nobody had spoken to him like this in years, maybe ever. People usually treated him like a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be brushed aside. But this woman, this judge, was looking at him like he mattered. Like his actions, no matter how long ago, still held value. I didn't do anything special, James muttered, looking down at the floor. Just doing my job. No, the judge said firmly, cutting him off. That's not true. What you did went beyond duty. You risked your life for strangers, for me. And yet after everything you gave, you came home to this. She waved a hand around the courtroom, encompassing the cold walls, the harsh lighting, the system that had somehow landed him here. We owe you better than this. I owe you better than this. Her words struck a chord not just with James, but with everyone in the room. Some of the spectators exchanged glances, whispering quietly among themselves. Others simply sat in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of the moment. For many, it was a stark reminder of how easily veterans could fall through the cracks once they returned home. They served their country with honor, only to face battles on the home front that no one prepared them for. The judge leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench. Tell me, James, she said, her tone softer now, almost pleading. What happened? How did you end up here? James hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Talking about his struggles had never come easily to him, but something about the judge's sincerity, the way she looked at him with genuine concern, made him want to open up. Maybe for the first time in years, he felt like someone actually cared about his story. I came home and it was hard, he began, his voice shaky at first but growing steadier as he continued. I tried to adjust, to find work, to live a normal life. But the nightmares, they wouldn't go away. Every night I relived the things I'd seen, the things I'd done. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Jobs didn't last long. Friends stopped calling. Family, well, I didn't really have any left. He paused, swallowing hard. Eventually, I ended up on the streets. At first, I thought it would just be temporary, that I'd figure things out. But the longer I stayed out there, the harder it got to leave. No one wants to hire a guy who looks like me, who smells like me. No one wants to help someone they think is a lost cause. His voice broke on the last few words, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed. The judge watched him intently, her expression filled with compassion. You're not a lost cause, James, she said firmly. Not to me. Not to anyone who knows your story. As she spoke, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the exchange unfolding before them. Lawyers scribbled notes furiously while reporters whispered excitedly to one another. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a reckoning, a moment of truth that challenged everyone present to reconsider what justice truly meant. For James, though, it was something else entirely. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a homeless man or a criminal, but as a human being. And as strange as it felt, he realized he didn't hate it. James sat on a hard wooden bench in the cold, sterile courtroom. The air smelled faintly of cleaning products and old paper, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. He was slouched forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the pressure. His clothes were even more worn than usual. His jacket had a tear near the shoulder, and one of his shoes was coming apart at the sole. He looked like someone who had been through too much for too long, and today wasn't going to be any different. The courtroom itself was busy, but impersonal. Lawyers shuffled papers, bailiffs stood stiffly by the walls, and spectators whispered, quietly among themselves. To most people in the room, James was just another name on the docket, another case to get through before lunch. No one paid him much attention. That was fine with James. He didn't want attention anyway. All he wanted was for this to be over so he could go back to, well, whatever passed for normal life these days. When the bailiff called his name, James slowly stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom. His steps were heavy, each movement deliberate, as though every ounce of energy had been drained from him. As he approached the judge's bench, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. He knew how this worked. The prosecutor would say something about trespassing or loitering, maybe throw in a comment about repeat offenses, and then the judge would hand down some kind of punishment. A fine he couldn't pay, community service he wouldn't complete, or another few nights in jail. It was always the same song, just a different verse. Sure enough, the prosecutor stepped up to speak. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began laying out the facts of the case in a monotone voice that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "the defendant has been charged with criminal trespassing and loitering. These are not isolated incidents. This individual has a history of similar violations and shows no effort to comply with basic societal rules." James didn't react. He barely even heard the words. They washed over him like background noise, meaningless and distant. He'd heard it all before, the lectures, the accusations, the thinly veiled judgment. What was the point of arguing? No one cared about why he slept in abandoned buildings or why he wandered aimlessly through the city streets. All they saw was a man who didn't fit into their neat little boxes of what society deemed acceptable. The judge listened silently as the prosecutor spoke, her expression unreadable. She was an older woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her black robe hung perfectly on her frame, and her glasses perched neatly on the bridge of her nose. Everything about her screamed authority, from the way she held her pen to the slight frown etched onto her face. People often described her as tough but fair, the kind of judge who followed the letter of the law without letting emotions cloud her decisions. When the prosecutor finished, the judge turned her gaze to James. "Do you confirm your identity?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. She glanced down at the file in front of her, scanning the details quickly. Then she paused, her brow furrowing slightly as if something had caught her attention. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Even the low hum of conversation faded away, leaving only silence. "State your full name for the record," the judge instructed, her tone shifting ever so slightly. There was something in her voice now, curiosity, recognition. James hesitated, unsure of what to make of the sudden change. Slowly, he lifted his head just enough to meet her eyes. "James Anderson," he murmured, his voice hoarse and barely audible. The judge's pen stopped moving. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, though no one could quite put their finger on why. James noticed the change too, but he didn't understand it. Why was she looking at him like that? Did she recognize him? Or was this just another trick of his tired mind, conjuring connections where none existed? Finally, the judge spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost reverent. "Private First Class James Anderson," she repeated, reading the name aloud from the file in front of her. There was weight behind those words, a gravity that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. James blinked, confused. Private First Class. It had been decades since anyone had referred to him that way. Back then, he'd worn his uniform with pride, standing tall alongside men and women who shared his sense of duty. But now he was just a homeless man sitting in a courtroom waiting for his sentence. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying him intently. "Is this correct?" she asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like confirmation. James nodded slowly, still unsure of what was happening. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. For a brief moment, the judge said nothing. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she did something that shocked everyone in the room, including James. She rose slowly to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor with a loud screech that echoed through the silent courtroom. Every pair of eyes turned, to her wide with surprise and confusion. What was going on? The judge stood there for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of the bench as if bracing herself. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. And then, to everyone's astonishment, she bowed her head. Not dramatically, but with a quiet respect that sent chills down James's spine. The room remained utterly silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was happening or why the judge was acting this way. All he knew was that something monumental was unfolding right in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. Whatever came next, he realized, would change everything, for better or worse. Cold wind whipped through the streets of downtown Chicago as James, a man in his late 50s, sat hunched over on a weathered park bench. His dark skin was roughened by years of living outdoors, and his clothes, a patched-up jacket and jeans, were barely holding together. He pulled the collar of his jacket closer to his neck, trying to shield himself from the biting November chill. His eyes scanned the empty park, searching for nothing in particular but somehow still hoping for something better. James had seen better days. Once upon a time, he wore a uniform with pride, standing tall as a soldier ready to defend his country. But now, all that remained were memories buried deep under layers of pain, loss, and struggle. After serving in the military, life hadn't been kind to him. There were no parades or thank you speeches waiting for him when he returned home. Instead, there was silence, a deafening silence that left him feeling invisible. Without family to lean on and struggling with PTSD, James found it hard to keep a job. Over time, he drifted further away from society until one day, he woke up, realizing he had nowhere else to go. For years, he'd lived on the streets, moving from one makeshift shelter to another, always just trying to survive. That morning started like any other. James woke up before sunrise, shivering under a thin blanket he kept rolled up in his backpack. He wandered around looking for warmth and food, eventually finding himself near an old abandoned building downtown. It wasn't much, but at least it offered some protection from the freezing air outside. So without thinking twice, he stepped inside and settled into a corner, pulling his knees close to his chest. But peace didn't last long. A couple of hours later, security guards patrolling the area spotted him through the cracked windows. They stormed in, shouting orders for him to leave. James tried explaining that he meant no harm, he only needed a place to rest. But they weren't interested in hearing excuses. Within minutes, police officers arrived, handcuffed him, and loaded him into the back of their patrol car. As they drove him to the station, James stared out the window, watching the city blur past. He felt numb, almost detached from reality. This wasn't the first time he'd been arrested for something small like trespassing or loitering. Every few months, it seemed, he'd end up in handcuffs for simply existing in places where people, like him, weren't supposed to exist. Each arrest added another mark to his record, making it harder for him to escape the cycle of poverty and homelessness. At the station, things moved quickly. Officers processed him, took his fingerprints, and handed him a blanket to sit on while he waited. No one asked why he was sleeping in that building or if he needed help. To them, he was just another name on a list, another case number to check, off before moving on to the next. James didn't argue. What was the point? He knew how this story went. It always ended the same way. Later that afternoon, James was transferred to the county jail to await his court appearance. As he sat alone, in a cold cell staring at the gray walls, he thought about how far he'd fallen. He remembered the days when he stood shoulder to shoulder with fellow soldiers, fighting for freedom and justice. Back then, he believed in something bigger than himself. Now, though, he couldn't help but wonder if anyone even cared that he existed anymore. Little did James know, his life was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. While he sat lost in his thoughts, oblivious to what lay ahead, wheels were already turning in ways that would change everything. Not just for him, but for others too. And soon enough, the world would see that behind the tattered clothes and weary face was a man whose story deserved to be told.